This time we take a look at what we think are 5 of the best sporting motor Guzzis. Now before we start, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content. Now if you've seen a few videos on this channel, you can't help but notice that we are most definitely fans of the machines produced on the Mondello del Lario. And over the years we have indeed owned quite a few of their rather quirky V-twins. Why? Because, well, we love the things. We're a bit mad that way. Now the Guzzi engines have of course been employed in a number of different bike formats: cruisers, naked bikes and adventure bikes. But the company has produced some fantastic sporting machines over the years, and here are what we think are our best 5. So much more interesting than some old cruiser, we think. Only joking, Californias are cool too. The Falcone. Right from the early beginnings with the Normale models, Guzzi was well known for its horizontal singles, with the first models appearing in 1921. These were generally characterised by being of unique construction with a large external flywheel. In the years before World War II, and in the immediate aftermath, the road-going range was topped by the GTV and GTW 500cc singles, with the slightly more sporty model, the GTW, making around 20 horsepower. Early models retained girder forks from the pre-war era, but these were soon replaced by upside-down telescopics. In 1950, the GTV was replaced by the newer store model at the top of the touring range, but they would need a new sporting model, and this would come in the guise of the Falcone. While this does look fairly similar to the earlier models, internally the engine was very different, with a lot of features taken directly from the Condor on Dondolino racing machines, including the 4-speed transmission and a combustion chamber with its 60-degree inclined valves. And while it is true that the engine performance was only slightly raised at 23 horsepower at 4,500 RPM, the machine was much more tunable. Compression ratio and standard trim was just 6.5 to 1, and there was a 29mm Del Auto carburetor. The whole machine weighed 167 kilos, and top speed was somewhere north of 85 miles an hour or 135 kilometers an hour. Steering is fairly slow. The bike is quite long after all, given the engine layout, but this does mean that it's very stable at speed, and unlike a lot of its competition in 1950, it also featured rear suspension. But while Guzzi sold an awful lot of lightweights during this period, production of their big singles was always very low, with many machines being sold to the military or police forces in Italy. And it's with this market in mind that the Noovo Falcone, the final version, was introduced in the late 60s, with some civilian sales in 70 and 71. The V35 Imola and V50 Monza. Now while they may resemble their bigger brothers, the small block Guzzis were a completely new design developed by Lino Tonti, and the machines are much smaller and more nimble than their bigger brothers. The overhead valve engine features Heron heads, something which is also found incidentally on motor marinis of course of the period. This used a flat top head, but with the combustion chamber effectively moulded into the piston crown. And while this did allow high compression ratios, 10.8 to 1 even on the earliest models, it does somewhat limit the valve sizes and ultimate power as the engines got bigger. The 346cc 350 came first, quickly followed by the 490cc 500. And it didn't come as a great surprise to anybody when sporty versions of those basic models soon followed, with the V35 Imola arriving in 1979. These machines featured a revised riding position and new styling, with a very stylish tank and cockpit design. And the engines were breathed on too, with larger carburetors for both models, resulting in a claimed peak horsepower of 36 horsepower at 8,200 RPM for the 350 Imola, and 48 horsepower at 7,600 RPM for the 500 Monza. The brake system used twin discs at the front and a single disc at the rear, and as on the larger machines these were linked. This meant that when you depressed the rear brake pedal, it also applied some pressure to one of the discs at the front. Some people really don't like this system, but to be honest, once you get used to it, you find it's actually very good. So our advice would be, don't go believing the naysayers on this one. Top speeds of the machines are of course fairly modest, they're not big engines after all. The 350 will get somewhere into the mid-90s, with the 500 hitting 107 on test in 1981. But it's the Tonti frame that shines on these machines, with one journalist in Britain describing it as probably the best handling motorcycle in the world in the late 70s. High praise indeed. The machines would go on pretty much unchanged until the beginning of the 1980s, when in 1984 they were replaced by the new 4-valve machines, which, like so many of the early 4-valve units, suffered top-end problems, blighting the reputation of Guzzi's sporty small blocks. The 1100 Sport. If ever a machine had an unusual beginning, it's the 1100 Sport, featuring as it did a chassis designed by an American dentist. And it was Dr. John Whitner whose great success in America leading to the development of the Daytona 4-valve sports bike. But this was only ever intended to be a limited production machine. Never one to let a good chassis go to waste, Guzzi would develop the 1100 Sport. This would feature what was essentially an enlarged version of the Lamon's 5 engine, fitted into a slightly cheaper version of the John Whitner frame. The result was a machine which was pretty much comparable to the much more expensive 4-valver. The result was a machine which sold, at least initially, in fairly good numbers. The engine was of 1064 cc's, and whilst outwardly very similar to the California 1100 unit, internally it was quite different, featuring 10.5:1 forged pistons and a much lightened crankshaft. There was a new camshaft too, developed by Crane in Florida in the USA. Other valve sizes were actually reduced compared to those on the Le Mans 5. With early models featuring 40mm Del Auto carburetors, peak power was claimed at 90 horsepower, with top speed as tested at around the 135 mph mark. The race-developed chassis with its parallelogram rear suspension units gave the bike excellent handling despite its long wheelbase. The final version of the 1100 Sport came in 1996 with the 1100 Sport injection, which, as the name suggests, made use of a Weber Minarelli fuel injection system similar to that used on the Daytona RS 4-valve units. And despite a slight drop in compression ratio to 9.5:1, top speed had actually increased to 139 mph, or 223 km/h. But unfortunately the 1100 Sport came too late and simply could not compete with Ducati's, frankly more advanced and higher performing V-twins. And so in 1998 a final batch of 200 1100 Sports was released, and that was the end of the road for possibly Guzzi's finest 2-valve V-twin. The V11 Sport. With the 1100 Sport and the Daytona on the way out, Guzzi knew they needed a replacement as a more sporting bike in the range. So using the 1100 Sport as a starting point, they developed a quite different machine. A machine which conceptually at least was intended as an update or reimagining of the original V7. The machine was first demonstrated at the Milan show in 1997, and while the power unit was very similar to that used in the final version of the 1100 Sport, it was a very different machine under the skin. The chassis was revised and there was a completely new fuel injection system and, for the first time, a 6-speed gearbox. And while still no lightweight at 221 kilos or 487 pounds, top speed was now up to around 143 mph. 1998 was the GT or half-fared version of the bike. By 2001 a new production line was in operation, which allowed the V11 to be produced in much greater numbers than its predecessor, the 1100 Sport, which was no bad thing because the V11 was a core part of the new Aprilia-backed range. 2003 would see the reintroduction of the Le Mans name in the beautiful V11 Le Mans Rosso Corsa. Now I did own one of these V11s for quite a while and did find the machine reasonably comfortable if a little bit sporty, and it handled quite well, although the suspension setup could be a little bit fiddly, it has to be said. The 6-speed transmission was very good, probably superior to the equivalent BMWs of the period if I'm honest. And engine performance was pretty good, especially in the mid and upper part of the rev range. Low down however it was a little bit flat, and much to my annoyance, when we did a roll-on test from 40 mph, Deb's California completely kicked my arse. That is until we got up to the higher reaches of the rev range when the bike went powering past. The V11 would remain in the range until the mid-2000s, when it was replaced by the all-new Carc-based range, beginning with the Breville 1100 arriving in 2005. The Le Mans 850. The Le Mans story really starts with the V7 Sport of the early 70s, which was the first Guzzi to make use of the Tonti frame. Early versions of the machine were actually constructed at the race shop, and the performance of these bikes came as an almighty shock to the opposition when it was tested in 1971. Later, more production-based versions of the machine were a little bit slower, but still pretty good performers for the time. But the problem was the original V7 was very expensive to produce, and so a simplified version, the S3, arrived in the mid-70s, and much of the styling of this machine is carried over onto the later Le Mans 850. During 71 and 72, Guzzi had campaigned the original V7 at various endurance events all over Europe, and would find success at Monza, but also at the endurance race at Le Mans, where they would finish on the podium. So when the decision was made to develop a sports machine based on the larger 844cc engine, the Le Mans name seemed a perfect fit. Initially, Alejandro Di Tommaso, the owner of Moto Guzzi at the period, was not keen on developing a sporty version of the twin, but was eventually persuaded to do so by Lino Tonti and the engineering department. Internally, the engine is very similar to the T3 touring model, even employing the same camshaft, but at the top end there are larger valves and a high dome piston giving a compression ratio of some 10.2 to 1, and lighter push rods would allow the engine to rev a little bit higher, something also helped by a lighter flywheel. Overall gearing was raised, and this does result in a rather tall first gear, so initial acceleration surprisingly wasn't quite as good as the T3, but with peak horsepower that claimed 80 horsepower at 7,300 rpm, the Le Mans was considerably faster, and that racing straight cut gearbox gave the machine a sound and feel all of its own. The Tonti frame of course gave excellent handling, and the brakes, by the standards of the time at least, were very good too. But this is very much a no compromise sports bike. The sitting position by 1970s standards is very radical. Hop off any Japanese multi of the period and onto the Le Mans and you understand just how different the machine was. Clutch and throttle action were of course notoriously heavy, so a sports touring BMW this certainly was not. But it's the styling of the Mark I that really sets it apart. It is the most iconic of all Moto Guzzis, and certainly one of the most desirable V-twins, original V7 aside. In 1978, Moto Guzzi would unveil the Mark II, and while under the skin this is essentially the same machine, a number of cosmetic and basic styling and system changes were made. There were lots more dials to give a dashboard that looked rather car-like, and the square headlamp and squared-off styling were viewed as less appealing aesthetically than the original bike had been, and this has unfortunately led to many Mark IIs being chopped to look much more like Mark Is. Consequently, the Mark II has now become something of a rare sight, which is a great shame because the machine in reality is much more sleek than it might initially appear, and the integrated bodywork does a great job of protecting the rider from the oncoming wind, making it much easier to maintain high speeds when you're riding a Mark II in comparison to a Mark I. And if you're in the market for a Le Mans 850, the Mark II can make a really good buy, being much cheaper to buy than even a fake Mark I. So the best way to get a genuine Le Mans is to buy a Mark II. Nobody makes replica Mark IIs, they all get converted to Mark I lookalikes. 1981 will see the introduction of the final 850 version of the Le Mans, and this is the Le Mans Mark III, a considerably different machine than what had gone before. There was a total restyle to the controls and dials, and the bodywork was now completely different, with a sleek and more updated look, which in some ways now resembled the small block machines like the V50 Monza. But the machine had to contend with new emission controls, so overall horsepower was down to around 76 horsepower, making the machine slightly slower than its predecessors, prompting the introduction of the 1000cc Le Mans in 1984. What other bikes and collections of bikes would you like to see us feature in a future video? Maybe you've got a bike we can use for a test ride. Either way, get in touch below. Hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe, and of course, thanks for watching.